All right, so we're going to look at the Jewish roots of the Eucharist and really the Old Testament roots of the Eucharist, and also the scriptural emphases with about communion and the Lord's Supper. So first, let's start with the scriptural expressions, the things that are right there on the page. All we have to do is read and compare and contrast. Okay, yeah. There's a Breaking Bad reference right there. Breaking bread. So, scriptural references, there's really three different expressions or emphases that we see, almost three different accounts or ways of explaining or emphasizing the Last Supper and the Eucharist. We see first the Matthean or like Matthew and Mark. Mark's is a far more abbreviated version of Matthew's, or Matthew's is an expanded version of Mark's, to put it maybe a bit more chronological in how they were written. That Matthew 26, Mark 14 are almost identical, except Mark's is a little bit shorter. The emphasis here is the blood of the covenant for the forgiveness of sins. He says, take and eat, and then he says, drink this, the blood of the covenant. And Luke 22 actually mirrors more closely Paul's account of the Eucharist and the Last Supper, I should say, in 1 Corinthians 11. What's important to note is Paul's account in the 1 Corinthians, the letter to the Corinthians, is probably the earliest of all of these documents, of all of these letters and gospels that were written. Paul's letter to 1 Corinthians probably outdates, very likely outdates, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, all of the gospel writings. And so what we see here is probably Luke drawing more from Paul. Remember, Luke is the doctor companion of Paul that we hear about in the book of Acts, and we also hear Paul reference in a few of his letters. And so Luke is leaning both on Matthew and Mark's writings, but also on Paul's emphasis of, we do this in remembrance of me. This is Matthew and Mark don't make mention of remembrance. They go straight to the blood of the covenant and for forgiveness. And Luke and Paul also say covenant in my blood. They emphasize it's a new covenant in my blood. And then Paul adds that it's to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And then in John 6, we have a very different way of thinking about bread and wine, or the body and blood of Christ, the symbolic, sacramental thinking here that Jesus uses. He says in John 6, this is not a Last Supper scene. This is in the middle of Jesus's ministry, but he starts talking about, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, and everyone's like, whoa, okay, like you're getting weird on us, Jesus. And the emphasis here is that because this is on the heels of feeding the 5,000, and Jesus is saying that just like that Jesus is like Moses, or like the Israelites that Jesus feeds, are like the Israelites in the wilderness. And Jesus says, I am the manna of heaven. The manna was me that was given to Moses and the Israelites. And then he says, I am the bread of life. So a different emphasis here throughout these three kind of vignettes that we receive. So next, those are three different scriptural areas of emphasis. Now let's look at three different typologies, or there's a typological resonance that the Last Supper and the Eucharist, in the broader sense, the ongoing practice, has with the temple and the temple typology, especially surrounding the three primary pilgrim feasts of ancient Judaism. So this is a picture of actually Herod's temple, or a model of it, not a Herod's temple here. And so those three feasts would have been going on during the time of Jesus, and he would have, this is the temple he would have come into, and he would have purified, or like turned over the tables, the money tables in the temple. This is that temple. So the three feasts we're going to look at here that have resonances and typology and figural references are the Passover or Pesach, Pentecost or Shavuot, and the Feast of Booths or Sukkot. The Feast of Booths we'll see is also has a couple other days attached with the Day of Atonement and the Jewish New Year. So let's start with Passover here. Here's a mosaic of the 12, Jesus and the 12 disciples with bread, but also 2 fish, kind of combining a couple different images and stories from the Gospels. So Passover remembers the rescue of God's rescue and ransoming the Israelites from their bondage in Egypt. And it's a victory over the oppression of that bondage. Remember the Abad in the book of Exodus is this showdown between the slavish Abad serving that the Israelites had to do for Pharaoh, and that God delivers them from that into the far lighter, the easy yoke of worship Abad, spiritual Abad, the serving and worshiping the Lord in the wilderness and at Sinai, and ongoing in a new covenant. That there's this victory over oppression and over sin and over the enemy taking place symbolically there, as well as a rescuing from Egypt, and that ransoming, that rescuing going on. And then the agape meal is something important to connect here, is that the Eucharist and also the Lord's Supper and Passover were a full meal. And so initially we see, even in the way that Paul talks and critiques and corrects the Corinthian church, is that the Passover, the Eucharist, it was still a full meal, not just a symbolic tasting of a wafer and a sip of juice. It was a meal shared together. It was a love feast. And we see that also in Passover. We see that actually in all the festivals, is that many of the offerings in the tabernacle, at the temple, and given in the Torah are actually, some of them are full burnt offerings that are completely burned up, but several of them are partially burned and then partially given back to the person offering the gift, offering the sacrifice, to have a meal, shared meal with their family or other people with them. And so we see that continue in what's called the agape meal early on, is that the Eucharist was a full supper, a full meal. And then this, like I said, is that with the Church of Corinth. And then also this connects in another way to Jesus, what's like meal ministry is what some people have called it. Andrew McGowan and Paul Bradbury are big names here, of pointing out maybe the Eucharist, the communion, is not just rooting out of the one Last Supper meal, but also that the Last Supper and that Passover meal of the Last Supper was part of a full, throughout all of Jesus's ministry. Jesus practiced ministry at the dinner table. He had a meal ministry. And so the Last Supper is just the last supper of many suppers that Jesus did ministry, that then communion Eucharist is actually a continuing expression of. One other thing worth noting here, while we're talking about the Eucharist, communion, and we're talking about Passover, is the Quartodeciman controversy. So this was in the early church, the first couple centuries of the church. There was In the East, in the West, pretty quickly, they moved to practicing always recognizing and celebrating the resurrection of the Lord on a Sunday. So Easter ended up quickly always falling on a Sunday, because Sunday had become the Lord's day. Very quickly, it was the eighth day of the week, seen as the eighth day for the first day of new creation, that Jesus was the firstborn of new creation and new man. And so you see them very quickly. Each Sunday now, each Lord's Day was treated as a mini Easter. And so then Easter was the big celebration of resurrection. The problem with that is that that is a weekly calendar. And while Passover is based on a lunar calendar where Passover can fall on any day of the week. And so the dilemma is, do we observe Passover and Good Friday kind of thing? Like Good Friday needs to be observed the day after the Last Supper. And so but if the Last Supper falls on, if you count according to the Jewish calendar, as Jesus did and the early apostles did, it's the 14th day of Nisan, the month of Nisan, which still is in that early spring era of March or April in our calendar. And so if you follow that date, and then the next day is the death of Christ on the cross. There's the day in the tomb, and then the following morning is the resurrection day. Those 4 days, because the 14th of Nisan, just like the 14th of any of our months, can fall on any day of the week. So then we have this dilemma of, okay, Easter, according to the Jewish calendar, can fall on any day of the week, just like Christmas can for us. And this was the way that the East and the early church continued to observe it. Polycarp of Smyrna represents this perspective. He was a disciple of the Apostle John. That he was a first generation student of the apostles, of the 12 disciples, and John was one of he was the last surviving of the 12 disciples, and even longer, 30 plus years longer than Paul, even if you count him in as a baker's dozen type of the 12 apostles. Then you've still got Polycarp is one of the oldest disciples of that first generation of the disciples of the apostles. Does that make sense? He's like second generation Christian, and he is celebrating Easter according to the 14th day of Nisan. He celebrates Passover, Good Friday, death of our Lord the next day, tomb, resurrection. So 15th, 17th day of Nisan would have been when he always celebrated Easter. But again, that doesn't always fall on Sunday. Most of the time it wouldn't, right? But in the West, already the Bishop of Rome and all the Western churches are saying no, and Western African churches are saying we want to celebrate Easter, the resurrection of our Lord, on that Sunday around those dates in early spring. And they meet to try to reconcile, because as much as we're like, okay, that like whatever, for them in the pre-modern world, this is a very important ritual to maintain, that there's power behind these faithful observances of these practices. And they meet to try to help each other see the perspective. And you can almost hear, there's recorded for us a letter that Polycarp wrote to Anicetus, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of Rome, but he wasn't called, they weren't called popes until the Middle Ages, around 800 or 1000 AD. And so Polycarp writes to the Bishop of Rome and says, like, this, I do this, I honor and count according to the 14th day of Nisan, the Jewish calendar, not the Julian calendar of Rome, which is very close to our calendar, because this is the way John did it. like you can almost hear the name drop and the sarcasm in the letter. And this letter is told to us. We don't have Polycarp's actual letter. We have Polycarp a letter, an account of this from Irenaeus, one of Polycarp's disciples. So we got John, Polycarp, Irenaeus. His recollection of Polycarp's letter saying, this is the way John did it. Okay, like, like guy who wrote the Gospel of John, Book of Revelation, 3 letters. That dude did it with 14th and Nissan, so that's what we do. Like, and that's recorded and carried on ultimately through later, like it comes to us through a chain of remembering what other people had written. So you can hear this, and they neither side is able to convince the other one. You can see here there's actually, there ends up being quite a, evidences that there's quite a bit of early anti-Jewish undertones to the fact that we're going to move this and always celebrate Easter on a Sunday. But in this moment, and that gets really, that those anti-Jewish undertones or overtones become very explicit in the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine makes a final decree for all of the Roman Empire, which is pretty much all of the Christian world at this point, other than a few few pockets out in India. That we are going to do it on a Sunday. We're going to calculate it according to the winter or the spring equinox and stuff like that, and all this stuff. Kind of, and he says, like, why should we hold ourselves captive to these people who have rejected Jesus? There's a lot by the 4th century, there's pretty strong antagonism against the Jews, even though that's where our Christian faith comes from. But in the 2nd century, early 2nd century, Polycarp is having this meeting at the latest around no later than 150 AD CE. And so we see here still grace between the two perspectives, because what we see is, even though neither side is willing to change their practice to bring into union, they still recognize each other's practices and honor them, as shown by when Polycarp came to Rome to discuss this with Anicetus. Anicetus lets Polycarp administer the Eucharist at their service, Lord's Day service that they have, or some type of service. He defers to Polycarp for administering the Eucharist. It wasn't an Easter thing or probably or Passover, but what it was a sign of respect of this person's practices and faith. And I think that's an important feature for us to remember in our ecumenical analysis and across denominations, and with our Messianic brothers and sisters, our Messianic Jewish brothers and sisters, that the different practices, like Paul talks about, are all done for the glory of God and for thankfulness to the Lord. And so we should honor one another's faithful expressions of our honor and worship to the Lord. Okay. So another important thing to realize here, here's proof or more resonance of how the Eucharist is a typology of Passover. This is especially drawn, this is drawn pretty extensively from Oscar Scarsane's book, In the Shadow of the Temple. It's also repeated now in Table and Temple by something Stubbs, Gary Stubbs. I think Gary might be the wrong first name. But anyways, so Passover, the Passover liturgy, take a look at this. And there's more going on here, but I pulled out the part that aligns with what we have recorded of the Eucharist, the Last Supper institution of the Eucharist in our scriptures. We see that a cup, an opening sanctification of the first cup, and then there's also a second cup, but then there's bread broken, words of explanation over the bread, and the story of the first Passover. It's not this bread is where then the youngest child of the Jewish family is asks the Father, well, Father, why are we eating only unleavened bread when every other time of the year we eat leavened bread? Why are we eating these bitter herbs? And there's three questions that are asked that are all really saying and asking the same question, which leads the father of the household to re-express and retell and recount the story of the first Passover. After this is told, then they sing the first Halal, which is Psalms 113, maybe Psalms 113 and 14 of the way that our book of Psalms counts it. And then the sanctification of the second cup and of the bread comes, and then there's a full finishing or blessing of the meal, and then there's a blessing of the third cup, and then once they finish the meal, they sing the rest of the Halal. And this is actually wrong. The Halals would actually go up through Psalm 118. I'll have to tweak that moving forward. And so then we see the Last Supper. So keeping that in mind, that was the Passover liturgy. Here's the Last Supper liturgy, especially from Luke, is that the Lord blesses the cup and said, "Take this and divide it, and I will not drink of it or eat of this again." And then the bread, he gives thanks for it. He blesses it. He breaks the bread and he gives it, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then the meal, and in the same way, after supper, as in Luke, it says this, and then he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." And then they sang a hymn. And the Hebrew the Hebrew name for the book of Psalms is the Hebrew word Tehillim. We looked at this last week, which means hymns or sung poems. So we see cup, bread, meal, cup in both the Passover liturgy and in the Last Supper, especially in the Lucan account. Okay, so that's Passover. The second pilgrim feast of the Jewish faith was and is Pentecost. This is the Feast of Weeks. It's a week of weeks, 49 days plus one, or Penta means 5. Penta costs 50 days, or Shavuot, 50 days after the Passover. This is the celebration of the law being given at Sinai. And notice here in Exodus 24, when the law is first ratified, it comes with a sprinkling of the blood of the covenant in Exodus 24, which is echoed also in Mark 14, as well as in Luke and Matthew. And then another resonance we see here. So that's an explicit reference. This is like word for word. We are seeing that the Last Supper and the institution of the Eucharist resonates with the language of Pentecost or Shavuot and at Sinai. And then the breaking of the bread in Acts 2, after the pouring out of the Spirit. Let me see which verse this is. Let me just read it. We see that the disciples dedicated themselves and they devoted themselves Acts 2:42, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, or literally didache. We'll look at that in a little bit later. And then the fellowship of the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. And in Exodus 19 and Acts 2, right before that breaking of bread passage, when the tongues of fire come and sit upon those in the upper room, Exodus 19 is when when the Lord, the Shekinah, descends on Mount Sinai in lightning and storm and whirlwind. And we see here in both Acts 12, Acts 2, like a rushing wind, the sound of a rushing wind, and then heavenly things like fire, both settling on Mount Sinai in Exodus and settling on the upper room and on the heads of the disciples in the upper room in Acts 2. We see these resonances with Pentecost, the event at Pentecost, and the breaking of bread, as all pointing back to the Eucharist communion practices, and with this second aligning with and resonating with the second pilgrim feast of the Jewish faith. And then the third, this one is likewise resonates, or the Eucharist resonates with the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot. And within the Feast of Booths, this is a longer time where they would camp. They would come back to Jerusalem and they would camp in tents, remembering their time in the wilderness when they were a Bedouin people, for lack of better words, living and wandering in the wilderness, living in tents, also remembering the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that lived in tents, even in what was the promised land. And within the Feast of Booths, we have Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and the head of the year, and also Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This was the one day of the year, Yom Kippur, when the high priest would go in and make an offering on the mercy seat here above the Ark of the Covenant, with a sprinkling of the blood again. And this anticipates these celebrations anticipate the full realization of what God designed Israel to be, which is a nation of priests to the nations, a kingdom of priests, which Peter picks up in that language in his letters. And this act of remembrance with an anticipation of a future thing. This is literally what the word anamnesis means in Christianity. In our faith, is anamnesis is a remembrance of something with future ramifications. We are remembering a future thing. It's remembering for us a heavenly banquet. As we come to the table, we are remembering a heavenly banquet of the fulfillment of the full second coming of the Messiah. And then also of note here is Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, and repentance. It is the day of forgiveness of sins, which is what is most readily associated for us with the remembrance of we remember the Lord's death until he comes, like Paul talks about, that Jesus' death and resurrection is for our minds first, in our Western minds, is first atonement, is a penal substitution, it's forgiveness of sins, right? It's like that actually aligns with, not with Passover, but with Yom Kippur, with the Feast of Booths, this futuristic or future looking celebration. And so we see with all three of these pilgrim festivals, we see with Passover, with Pentecost, and with the Feast of Booths, the Day of Atonement, we see resonances with each of these with communion. So in summary, I'm scooching the wrong way. This is not mirrored. So 3 different biblical emphases. We have the Matthean and Markan emphasis on covenant forgiveness. Paul and Luke's emphasis on covenant and forgiveness, but also remembrance of Christ's death, the Lord's death. Then there's also the Johannine emphasis on I am the bread of life and I am the manna from heaven. And then 3 temple typologies: Passover with the rescue and victory over sin from the past that continues to the and then Pentecost, that is the giving of the law on Sinai, is mirrored and resonates with the giving of the Spirit on Pentecost in Acts 2, and both of which are present empowerments for us to walk with the Lord. And then the Feast of Booths, or the Day of Atonement, is a looking to the future of a heavenly banquet, and also the atonement of our sins. So consider these new, each one of these new emphases for you. And next time you take communion, look at it through one of these different lenses than what you're used to. And let me pray.